January 24th, 2026. A Saturday morning. Most Americans are having breakfast, scrolling through their phones, planning their weekend, and then President Donald Trump drops a bombshell that sends shockwaves through global markets. If Canada makes a deal with China, it will immediately be hit with a 100% tariff against all Canadian goods and products coming into the USA. 100%, not 10%, not 25%. 100%. That's not a tariff. That's an economic blockade. That's a declaration that America's closest ally, its largest trading partner, the country it shares the world's longest undefended border with, has crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. But here's what makes this story absolutely stunning. Canada already made the deal, a week earlier, while Trump was still praising it. And now, in a dramatic reversal that perfectly captures the chaos of modern geopolitics, Trump is threatening to economically devastate America's neighbor over an agreement he previously called a good thing. Welcome to the New World Order, where friends become rivals, where trade deals become weapons, and where Canada, polite, peaceful Canada, is teaching the United States a lesson about what happens when you push your allies too far. Let's start with what actually happened, because the media has been spinning this in every direction, and you need to understand the real story. On January 16, 2026, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney traveled to Beijing for direct talks with Chinese President Xi Jinping. This wasn't a routine diplomatic visit. This was strategic. This was deliberate. And this was Canada sending a message to Washington. The deal they announced was straightforward on paper but revolutionary in its implications. China agreed to slash tariffs on Canadian agricultural exports. Canola seed oil tariffs would drop from 85% to just 15% starting March 1st. Canadian canola meal, lobster, crab, and peas would be exempt from Chinese anti-dumping tariffs through at least the end of 2026. In exchange, Canada would allow 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles into the Canadian market annually, applying a reduced tariff rate of just 6.1%. Now, you might be thinking, that sounds like a reasonable trade deal between two countries trying to reduce barriers. What's the big problem? Here's the problem. Just 4 months earlier, in October 2024, Canada had mirrored the United States by imposing a crushing 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles. Canada had stood shoulder to shoulder with America, presenting a united North American front against Chinese industrial policy. Now they were reversing course, publicly, dramatically, and they were doing it while Trump was actively waging an economic war against American allies. When the announcement first came out on January 16th, Trump's response was surprisingly supportive. A reporter asked him if he was concerned about Canada getting closer to China. Trump's answer? That's what he should be doing. It's a good thing for him to sign a trade deal. If you can get a deal with China, you should do that. 8 days later, Trump called that same deal grounds for economic warfare. What changed? To understand Trump's fury, you need to understand what happened in Davos, Switzerland, at the World Economic Forum. On January 20th, Mark Carney stepped onto the stage at Davos and delivered what can only be described as a diplomatic middle finger to the Trump administration. Without once mentioning Trump's name, Carney gave a speech that everyone in that room understood as a direct rebuke of American policy. "We are in the midst of a rupture, not a transition," Carney declared. "A rupture, not a disagreement, not a rough patch. A rupture, a breaking point in the relationship between the United States and its Western allies that, as Carney would later clarify, may never be fully repaired." Carney warned that stronger countries were using economic integration as weapons, tariffs as leverage, and supply chains as vulnerabilities to be exploited. He urged the world's middle powers, countries like Canada, Australia, South Korea, European nations, to act together. Middle powers must act together because if we're not at the table, we're on the menu, he said. Think about that phrase. On the menu. Carney was telling the world that Trump's America sees its allies not as partners, but as prey. Trump watched this speech, and he was furious. 2 days later, Trump delivered his own remarks at Davos, and he went after Carney directly. "Canada lives because of the United States," Trump declared. "Remember that, Mark, the next time you make your statements." It was a threat disguised as a reminder, a flex of American power, the economic equivalent of know your place. Carney's response came swiftly. In a statement that Canadian politicians rarely make, he pushed back hard. Canada and the United States have built a remarkable partnership in the economy, in security, and in rich cultural exchange. But Canada doesn't live because of the United States. Canada thrives because we are Canadian. And then Trump revoked something. On January 23rd, he withdrew Canada's invitation to join his so-called Board of Peace, a newly created council of allied nations meant to coordinate on security and economic issues. Canada was being kicked out of the club, not for opposing American policy, but for daring to question whether American leadership was reliable anymore. Throughout this entire crisis, Trump has been doing something both petty and revealing. He refuses to call Mark Carney Prime Minister. Instead, Trump repeatedly refers to him as Governor Carney. In his Truth Social posts threatening the 100% tariff, Trump wrote, "If Governor Carney thinks he is going to make Canada a drop-off port for China to send goods and products into the United States, he is sorely mistaken. Governor, not Prime Minister. Governor." It's the same tactic Trump used with former Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. And it's not an accident. It's not a slip of the tongue. It's part of Trump's ongoing campaign to suggest that Canada should become America's 51st state. He's said it repeatedly. He's joked about it. Except he's not really joking. The message is clear. Canada isn't a sovereign nation in Trump's eyes. It's a rebellious province that needs to remember who's in charge. This isn't just rhetoric. This reflects a fundamental worldview where American allies are subordinates, not partners, where sovereignty is conditional on obedience. And it's precisely this attitude that's driving Canada and other American allies into the arms of other powers, including China. Trump's central accusation in his tariff threat is that Canada is trying to become a drop-off port for Chinese goods, that China will use Canada as a backdoor to avoid American tariffs. Here's what he wrote. "The last thing the world needs is to have China take over Canada. It's not going to happen, or even come close to happening. Is this fear legitimate? Could Canada actually become a transshipment point where Chinese goods enter through Canadian ports, get relabeled, and then cross into the United States tariff-free? The short answer is, theoretically possible, but practically ridiculous. Here's why. The Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement, known as USMCA in the US and CUSMA in Canada, has strict rules of origin. For goods to qualify for duty-free treatment, they must have a certain percentage of North American content. You can't just ship a Chinese television to Vancouver, slap a Made in Canada sticker on it, and drive it across the border to Seattle. That's fraud. That's already illegal. And customs officials on both sides know how to detect it. More importantly, Matthew Holmes, Executive Vice President of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, issued a statement clarifying that the agreement with China is fundamentally about domestic consumers and businesses in Canada and China, not schemes aimed at other markets. The 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles Canada is allowing in, those are for Canadian consumers, not for re-export to America. But here's the thing. Trump's accusation isn't really about the technical details of customs enforcement. It's about control. Trump doesn't want Canada making independent trade decisions. Period. Even if those decisions don't harm American interests. Even if they're completely within Canada's sovereign rights. The message is, if you're going to do business with China, you better ask Washington for permission first. Let's go back to that moment on January 16th. Canada announces the China deal. A reporter asks Trump about it at the White House. Trump's response, that's what he should be doing. It's a good thing for him to sign a trade deal. If you can get a deal with China, you should do that. Clear, unambiguous, supportive. 8 days later. If Canada makes a deal with China, it will immediately be hit with a 100% tariff. What happened in those 8 days? Davos happened. Carney's speech happened. The rupture comment happened. The Canada doesn't live because of the United States response happened. This isn't about the China deal. This is about punishment for defiance. And here's what makes this so dangerous for American foreign policy. If your allies can't predict your position from one week to the next, they stop relying on you. They start building alternative relationships, alternative supply chains, alternative security arrangements. Trade policy experts are watching this with alarm. Inu Manak, senior fellow for international trade at the Council on Foreign Relations, told CNN, "It sounds like Trump is lashing out at Carney for stealing the limelight at Davos. He didn't get his tariffs over Greenland, so now he's searching for another target to threaten." Think about that. Trump's trade policy isn't strategic. It's reactive. It's emotional. Just days before threatening Canada, Trump had vowed to impose 10% tariffs on Denmark and several other European allies unless they agreed to let America acquire Greenland. When that framework was reached, he backed down. Now he needs a new target, a new enemy, a new crisis to dominate the news cycle. And Canada, America's largest trading partner, closest ally, and most integrated economic partner, just became that target. Let's talk about what a 100% tariff on Canadian goods would actually do, because the numbers are staggering. Canada is the top export destination for 36 U.S. states. Nearly $3.6 billion Canadian, that's $2.7 billion U.S., worth of goods and services cross the border each day. About 60% of U.S. crude oil imports are from Canada. 85% of U.S. electricity imports come from Canada. Canada is also the largest foreign supplier of steel, aluminum, and uranium to the United States. If you watched our previous video on the Canadian resource crisis, you already know how catastrophic cutting off Canadian imports would be for the American economy. Gas prices would spike, refineries would shut down, nuclear plants would run out of fuel, but a 100% tariff doesn't cut off imports. It doubles their price. Imagine your gas price not just going up 80 cents overnight, but doubling entirely. Imagine the price of electricity in states that import Canadian hydropower suddenly doubling. Imagine American manufacturers who depend on Canadian steel and aluminum watching their input costs double instantly. They can't absorb that. They either shut down or they pass those costs to consumers. And here's the kicker. This wouldn't just hurt Canada. Erica York, Vice President of Federal Tax Policy at the Tax Foundation, made a stunning observation. If Trump follows through, it would mean the U.S. is imposing harsher trade restrictions on imports from Canada than from China. Read that again. America would be treating its closest ally worse than it treats its primary geopolitical adversary. The tariff on Chinese goods, 25% in most cases. The threatened tariff on Canadian goods, 100%. Canada would be punished more severely than China for the crime of doing business with China. Here's where this gets even more complicated. The Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement, which Trump himself negotiated during his first term, is up for review in 2026. Under the USMCA, most Canadian goods enter the United States duty-free or at very low tariff rates. That's the foundation of the integrated North American economy. But the agreement has a specific clause. If any of the three countries enters into a free trade agreement with a non-market economy, code for China, the other countries can terminate the deal. So here's the question everyone's asking. Is Canada's agreement with China technically a free trade agreement? Canada's Finance Minister Dominic LeBlanc was very clear on this point. He posted on social media, "There is no pursuit of a free trade agreement with China. What has been achieved is a resolution on several important tariff issues. Not a free trade agreement, just a targeted reduction of specific tariffs on specific products." But Trump doesn't seem to care about those distinctions. And that's the problem. If Trump claims Canada violated the USMCA, he could potentially withdraw from the agreement entirely. That would blow up the entire North American trading system. But here's the irony that trade experts are pointing out. If Trump uses that clause against Canada, it might backfire. The United States has its own deals with China. America imports billions of dollars in Chinese goods. American farmers depend on Chinese markets for soybeans. As Inu Manak noted, if Trump claims Canada violated USMCA through its China deal, it may put the United States soybean deal with China under similar scrutiny. You can't have it both ways. You can't demand that your allies cut ties with China while you maintain your own profitable relationships with Beijing. So how is Canada responding to all of this? with remarkable composure. Prime Minister Carney held a press conference on Sunday, January 26th, one day after Trump's tariff threat. And his message was clear, calm, and uncompromising. Carney said that Canada respects its obligations under the CUSMA agreement and will not pursue a free trade agreement with China without notifying the other two parties. Translation: we're following the rules, we're not violating any agreements, and we're not backing down. But Carney also made something else clear. Canada is diversifying. It's reducing its dependence on the United States, and that's exactly what the Pacific Gateway Initiative is about. Canada is fast-tracking LNG terminals on the West Coast. It's accelerating critical mineral exports to Japan, South Korea, and yes, China. The Royal Bank of Canada called this strategy exactly what it is: the dependency trap exit strategy. For decades, Canada's economy has been 70% dependent on trade with the United States. That made Canada vulnerable. Every time Washington threatened tariffs, Ottawa had limited options. Not anymore. Canada has oil pipelines to the Pacific now. It has trade agreements being negotiated with the EU. It has partnerships with Asian economies that are hungry for Canadian resources. Canadian policymakers have concluded that being 70% dependent on the United States for trade represents an unacceptable national security risk. They're willing to endure a short-term recession to break that dependence permanently. This is the nightmare scenario for American strategists. Not that Canada becomes an enemy, but that Canada becomes neutral. That it says, we'll trade with everyone equally. We're not picking sides anymore. Because the moment Canada stops seeing itself as part of the American sphere, the entire architecture of North American defense and economic integration starts to crumble. Let's zoom out and look at what Trump's policy is actually accomplishing. The stated goal of American tariff policy is to bring manufacturing back to the United States, to reduce dependence on China, and to strengthen American economic power. What's actually happening? America is pushing its closest allies toward China. Canada is negotiating resource deals with Beijing. European countries are exploring alternatives to American technology and defense systems. Mexico is quietly expanding its Chinese partnerships. We're seeing the formation of what some analysts are calling a middle power coalition. Countries like Canada, Australia, South Korea, and European nations that are tired of being caught between American demands and Chinese economic gravity. These aren't anti-American countries. They're pro-themselves countries. They're looking out for their own national interests in a world where American reliability has become questionable. And here's what's terrifying for long-term American strategy. These relationships, once built, are very hard to undo. If Canada spends the next 2 years building out Pacific export infrastructure, signing long-term contracts with Asian buyers, and reorienting its economy away from the United States, that doesn't reverse when Trump leaves office. If Canadian uranium is powering Chinese nuclear reactors instead of American ones, that supply relationship becomes permanent. If Canadian aluminum is going into Japanese cars instead of American F-35s, that's a strategic vulnerability that could last decades. Trump is playing a short game with long-term consequences. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent tried to justify the tariff threat on Sunday, telling ABC News that the U.S. could not let Canada become an opening that the Chinese pour their cheap goods into the U.S., but that's solving an imaginary problem while creating a real one. The imaginary problem? Chinese goods being transshipped through Canada to avoid U.S. tariffs. This is already illegal, already monitored, and not what Canada's trade deal enables. The real problem? Driving Canada into strategic partnerships that reduce American influence, weaken North American integration, and give China exactly what it wants: wedges between the United States and its allies. Here's something you need to understand about Trump's tariff threats. Wall Street has a term for it: TACO. Trump always chickens out. It started with the Greenland tariffs. Trump threatened 10% tariffs on multiple European allies unless they agreed to let America acquire Greenland. Days later, after a framework was reached, he backed down. Before that, there was the threat of 10% additional tariffs on Canada over an anti-tariff advertisement that Ontario ran featuring Ronald Reagan. Trump promised to follow through. He didn't. So will Trump actually implement 100% tariffs on Canadian goods? Many analysts doubt it. Erica York from the Tax Foundation said, "The threat alone illustrates how erratic and unreliable U.S. trade policy is at this moment." But here's why the taco pattern is dangerous. It's not just about whether Trump follows through. It's about the credibility crisis it creates. American allies can't plan. They can't make long-term decisions. They don't know if a threat is real or just a negotiating tactic. They don't know if a promise today will be reversed tomorrow. And when you can't rely on someone's word, you stop making deals with them. You start building alternatives. The Supreme Court is expected to rule in the coming weeks on whether Trump even has the legal authority to impose tariffs using emergency economic powers. Justices have appeared skeptical. If the court rules against Trump, his entire tariff strategy could collapse. But the damage to relationships? That's already done. So where does this crisis go from here? Option 1. Trump backs down. He calls the threat a negotiating position. He praises Carney for being smart and tough. He claims victory and moves on. This is the taco scenario. It's humiliating for American credibility, but it's the least economically damaging outcome. Option 2. Trump implements the tariffs, but exempts critical sectors. Oil, uranium, electricity, and a few other categories get waivers for national security reasons. This lets Trump claim he's being tough while avoiding the worst economic consequences. But it also shows that his threats are hollow and his tariffs are selective. Option 3. Trump actually implements full 100% tariffs across the board. This triggers immediate economic chaos. Gas prices explode, power grids destabilize, American manufacturers shut down. The political backlash is immediate and severe. Within weeks, maybe days, the tariffs get rolled back. But by then, Canada has accelerated its pivot away from the United States. Option 4. Canada calls the bluff. They announce that if 100% tariffs are implemented, they'll retaliate by restricting energy exports, uranium shipments, and critical minerals. Suddenly, Trump is facing not just higher prices, but actual shortages. The crisis escalates into something resembling economic warfare between neighbors. My prediction? We're heading toward option 2, selective tariffs with lots of exemptions. Enough for Trump to claim he's being tough on Canada, not enough to actually break the North American economy. But here's what won't change. Canada's strategic direction. The diversification is happening. The Pacific pivot is real. The dependency trap exit strategy is underway. Trump's threats aren't stopping that. They're accelerating it. Let's talk about what this really means. For 75 years, since the end of World War II, the United States has been the organizing principle of the Western Alliance. American military power guaranteed security. American economic power guaranteed prosperity. And American leadership provided coordination. That system is fracturing. Not because America lost a war, not because the economy collapsed, but because American policy became unpredictable, transactional, and punitive toward its own allies. Mark Carney used the word rupture in Davos, and he was right. This isn't a temporary disagreement that gets smoothed over at the next G7 meeting. This is a fundamental reassessment by American allies about whether Washington can be trusted. And once that trust is broken, it's incredibly hard to rebuild. China is watching all of this with satisfaction. Beijing doesn't need to defeat the American alliance system. They just need to wait for Washington to defeat itself. Every tariff threat against Canada, every trade war with Europe, every demand that allies choose between American loyalty and their own economic interests, these are all gifts to Chinese strategy. China offers something simple: trade, investment, infrastructure. No demands for regime change, no lectures about democracy, no threats to impose sanctions if you don't vote the right way at the UN, just business. And for countries tired of American unpredictability, that's starting to look pretty appealing. On January 24, 2026, Donald Trump threatened to impose 100% tariffs on America's closest ally because that ally dared to reduce trade barriers with China. The threat probably won't be fully implemented. Trump will likely back down or grant exemptions. He'll claim victory and move to the next crisis. But the damage is done. Canada has learned that American friendship is conditional. that American promises are temporary, that American leadership is unreliable, and Canada is responding by building alternatives. This is how empires decline, not with dramatic defeats on battlefields, but with the quiet erosion of alliances, with friends becoming neutral, with partners becoming competitors. Trump thinks he's being tough. He thinks he's defending American interests. What he's actually doing is teaching the world how to function without American leadership. And that lesson, once learned, cannot be unlearned. The tariff threat against Canada isn't just bad policy. It's a preview of a world where America is no longer the indispensable nation, where allies chart their own course, where middle powers build their own networks. Welcome to the post-American world order. It's being built right now, one trade deal at a time, one tariff threat at a time, one rupture at a time. Thanks for watching. If this analysis opened your eyes to how quickly alliances can collapse, hit that subscribe button, because the next chapter of this story is already being written, and it's going to reshape global geopolitics for decades to come. The question isn't whether Canada will back down. The question is, how many other American allies will follow Canada's lead?